Well, I'm back. It's been a couple of weeks here. It took us 3 weeks, I think it was, from Q&A. But now I'm back, episode 17 here. Got through the holidays. It was pretty crazy. The way the holidays ended up stacking up this year, like Christmas was on a Wednesday, New Year's was on a Wednesday. It was really weird. We ended up taking off Christmas Eve and Christmas here at the Goulet Pen Company. So with the Christmas rush and everything, we had like a weekend and then a day to try to get caught up, and then off 2 days for Christmas, and then 2 days to catch up, and then another weekend. And then we had physical inventory on the 31st. On Tuesday, and then we had the off on the 1st. It was really crazy for us here. So I'm really glad that we took that time off from Q&A. I know you got a couple of you guys kind of missed us and all that, and I'm glad to see that I'm such a part of your life here, such a part of your routine. But now all the craziness of the holidays is over. I plan to get back into kind of a regular thing with the weekly Q&A. So I'm kind of kicking it back off here again. This is an open forum this week. Next week I'll kick it off with a theme again, but had my daughter's second birthday in the middle of all that stuff too, because she's born 4 days before Christmas. Got my son's birthday coming up here this month. It's kind of crazy. My mom was diagnosed with breast cancer not long ago. She went through radiation treatments and all that. It's really just been crazy. She's doing okay, by the way, just in case you're wondering if you haven't been getting our newsletter and stuff like that. We've been kind of updating everybody, but I never know who's stumbling upon me for the first time here. But anyway, so it's been a little crazy. But anyway, that's okay. Getting back to it now. So that said, I got open forum. I got a slew of questions. I had a lot of questions, and I'm not going to be able to get to them all. I'm just going to apologize. We're starting to get to the point now where I'm getting so many questions. I can't cover every question each week. So I'm really sorry if you post a question and I don't get to it. I just can't cover everything. Otherwise, Q&A would just keep getting longer and longer and longer, and I just can't do that. So that said, I may have to keep it a little shorter this week just because I've got a meeting and stuff I've got to get to. It's been a little crazy even still having taken that time off, but questions are important, so let me stop rambling. I'm going to get on to it. Okay, first question. Donald R. on Facebook said, the sub-freezing temperatures seem to be on everyone's mind right now. So with that in mind, how does the cold affect fountain pens and ink? Great question. You got a couple other questions here. Do rapid changes in temperature affect the flow you can expect? For example, having your pen in a bag while walking outside for some time and then entering in a heated building. And one more question. Is it possible for ink to freeze in a pen, thus damaging it? And if so, what are the best ways to protect against this? So everything here you have, or you're asking me, Donald, is all about temperature and cold and stuff like that. And that's a very good question. I've been getting a lot of questions about that. So basically freezing, if your ink freezes up completely in your pen, that's bad because ink is mostly made of water, and when water freezes, it expands. So if you have a lot of water in a pen, it expands. It could very well damage the inside of your pen. That's the physics of it, but I've never actually really heard of that being a problem for anybody. So yes, there is that risk of happening. I'm sure it's happened to some people, but it's not anything that I hear of happening a lot. It's kind of like ink leaking or a pen leaking on an airplane. Like, I hear of a lot of people that are concerned about it, but I don't hear of it actually happening to that many people. So I think with some basic preparation, you'd be okay. You know, if you're going to be walking outside and you know that your pen is going to be exposed to very cold temperatures for a long enough period of time where you think that the ink might actually freeze inside your pen, well, the first thing you can do is empty your pen before you go traveling anywhere, if you know that's going to be the case. That's not always practical. So if that was the case, what I would do, instead of keeping your pen in your bag, put it in your pocket. You know, your pocket that's close to your body. The body heat will keep your pen warm enough so that it will not freeze. I'd recommend doing that for anything that's a risk of freezing, like your cell phone or your ink, that kind of stuff. Keep it on your person, you keep it nice and warm. Or if it's in a bag, try and keep it as insulated as you possibly can. Don't stick it right on the outside of your bag, but try and keep it inside there, inside a cloth or something. I don't know, whatever it is. I don't live in extremely cold temperatures here in Virginia, so I don't really have that problem as much. I don't hear of that being a problem as much, but something to think about. Now you're asking about flow. Okay, so will it affect the flow? Well, yes, technically water as it gets colder will not flow quite as well. So as your pen gets closer to that freezing temperature, it will impede the ink flow. I don't really know chemically what you might want to do to impact that. I think it's more of a temperature thing, so just try to keep it up to a warmer temperature. That said, the Noodler's Polar series of inks, Noodler's is the only brand of ink that I know of that's done anything to address using a pen in freezing temperatures. Go figure, you know. So But Noodler's has addressed it. So all the Noodler's inks, Polar Brown, Polar Blue, Polar Green, Polar Black, those will all work in sub-freezing temperatures. I think it's down to negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's quite below freezing. So whatever Nathan Tardif has done to those inks makes it so that you don't have to be quite as cautious, I guess, when using the pen in freezing temperatures. So that's what I would recommend. If you were really, really in those cold temperatures a lot, try the Polar inks during those coldest times. And then the other thing that I would like to point out that you didn't ask about, but when you have lower temperatures, typically you're looking at a lower relative humidity as well. So there you might be more impacted by ink drying out in the pen, ink flow issues and stuff like that. So that's just something that you may want to watch out for as well. Storing your pen in some type of airtight container will help with that, something like a Ziploc snack bag or something like that. Or another thing I've heard of people doing is cutting up a very small piece of sponge, wetting it and sticking it inside the cap of your pen if there's room in there. And then that will kind of act as like a little humidor inside your cap. So kind of a neat little trick there. Okay, Tom J in an email said, in the next Q&A video, will you tell us who designed your wonderful GouletPens company logo? Did someone write the company name by hand with a fountain pen? And who came up with the ink splash? Well, I don't know who I can actually credit the initial inspiration, but this was back in the very earliest days when it was just Rachel and I. And her younger sister is a photographer, and we were just kind of thinking of ideas. This was long before anybody knew who we were. So basically we had the idea of doing an ink splatter because back in the earliest days we really didn't do anything with pens. It was all about ink and paper. So we came up with the idea to do this ink splatter. And so it was really just kind of an experiment. Rachel's sister, Rebecca, she was just kind of, you know, we kind of thought of like, let's just drop some ink on a piece of paper and see what happens. So we'd kind of drip it on there and it ended just kind of splattering all over the place. So we dripped it and kind of concentrated in an area and then kind of used a straw to blow it around a little bit to get this kind of thing. And so we just did it a bunch of times until we found this pattern that was kind of appealing to us, and it kind of ended up looking like the continent of Africa a little bit. You know, wasn't really significant, but it just kind of ended up looking cool. And so we just went with that, and then, you know, took a photo of it, and then cleaned it up a little bit because the original logo had splatter all over the place. So it had like kind of this main body, and then it had these little splatters that kind of came off of it, but then it just had dots and specks everywhere around it because we were literally like from 4 feet above just dropping ink, and it was just going all over the place. So we had to kind of, you know, digitally clean it up and everything, and we tweaked the color to get it kind of this poppy blue that we really liked, that was kind of, you know, me and Rachel's favorite color is kind of that cerulean type blue. So that's where that came from. And then the written font, the handwritten font was just kind of, you know, duh, why we want something handwriting, because it very makes sense of being in the pen business. So that was actually a font that we found and, you know, got the rights to use. So it was, that was, you know, not any handwriting that we did. It was just we were going for a handwritten font and kind of did that and tweaked it and cleaned it up and stuff like that. And so that's really where it kind of came up from. So it was this kind of a, I guess, a think tank of me and Rachel and her sister back in the earliest days of the Goulet Pen Company. And it's, you know, it's kind of worked with us so far, and we don't really have any plans to change it. So there you go. Okay, so next one. At Kate Sarin on Twitter said, when trying new ink samples, is it possible to just dip a Pilot Metropolitan? Yeah, you can definitely do that. You know, whenever you're testing ink samples, cleaning out the pen is always the most time-consuming part. So obviously, the less of the pen you have to ink up, the better. So when you got a Pilot Metropolitan, for example, it can work. It's not going to be like the best pen for dipping, mainly because the feed on the Metropolitan does not have any fins on the outside of it. If you do have a pen with fins on it, I'm thinking of like, you know, a TWSBI pen, just because that comes to mind right now because I've just been using that one. Those ones do have fins on the feed, so that will kind of grab more of the ink just in a dipping motion there. Something like the Pilot Metropolitan doesn't have a lot of fins, so there's not a lot that's going to grab on. So if you're going to dip it in there and hold it for a minute. And then go and write with it. You're not going to get that far, but it'll give you enough to get you a basic idea. And then, yeah, I think that pretty much covers that. So Randy T on Facebook said, When converting any pen to an eyedropper, how often should you supply or reapply the silicone grease to the threads? Every time you refill a pen, or is once enough? You're going to want to do it every time you fill the pen. You may be able to get away with going 1 or 2 more times after that, but every time you're opening up that pen, that silicone grease is getting spread around somewhere. And you can't just put tons and tons of stuff on there because it'll squeeze out. So it's really, it's just to fill in the gaps that are on those threads. The one thing I will say is if you're using an O-ring, if you have a pen that can accommodate an O-ring in addition to the silicone grease really kind of just becomes redundant. It's kind of like a backup. The O-ring will mainly get the job done. So that would be kind of the rare exception. If you have an O-ring and silicone grease, you don't need to use the silicone grease every time. You almost don't even need the silicone grease. It's just kind of a backup thing. So, but if your silicone grease is your only barrier for keeping that entire body of ink from leaking out of your pen, you'll want to grease that thing up every time. But one little tub of silicone grease will last you forever, so you'll be good. Michael H. on Facebook said, is there any way to help the feed of the Pilot Falcon keep up with the flex? I purchased the new rhodium trim one from Goulet. Cool. And love it 95% of the time. That 5% of the time when I try to add a little bit of additional flair, though, and flex it harder, it railroads. Thanks. Yeah, I've experienced this myself. It's not uncommon with pretty much all flex pens to get railroading of some kind. It takes a lot of practice. When you do flex it out hard like that, you got to slow down quite a bit. That is one thing that you definitely got to do, especially when you have a pen like this that, you know, can go from such a fine line to such a thick line. The ink flow keeping up is going to be an issue because you're spreading those tines really wide. The demand of the ink flow increases dramatically when you're flexing a nib like that. And so you want to slow down quite a bit because that will help tremendously with keeping the ink flow. You may want to try a different ink as well. It could be that the ink that you're using is just not as conducive to being used in that flex. You may want to experiment, see whatever other inks you have on hand, try some of those out and see maybe something about the viscosity or the way that it flows or something. It might be a little wetter. That alone may increase the flow enough to help you out quite a bit with that railroading. And then the last thing is, you know, you're asking about modifications and stuff. Well, you didn't specifically ask me about modifications. I don't know why I just said that, but anyway, if you are looking to have anything modified in terms of the nib or the feed or anything like that to keep up with more flow, I would recommend getting it done by a pro. It's not easy to do with a flex pen like this, so I would stick to that. But I think between the combination of slowing down, changing the ink, and practicing more, I think you'll notice that happens a whole lot less. At Devin L. Thompson on Twitter said, what's the best way to store pens on my desk? Is it okay to keep them vertical, nib up, or horizontal? I've kind of addressed this in previous Q&As, but I know they tend to kind of get buried. So check out my video, Fountain Pen 101, Storing Your Fountain Pens. That will pretty much address everything here, but just to give a quick summary, there is no necessarily right or wrong answer about how you should store your pens. Me personally, I store most of mine horizontal. Basically, if you store them nib up, your pen's going to be drier. Store it horizontal, it's going to be kind of in the middle, and if you store it nib down, it's going to be wetter. So depending on the particular pen you're using, whether it tends to have problems starting, you want to keep it down. If you find it's really, really wet when you go to use it, you may want to keep it up. Or just kind of in the middle of the road. I keep all of mine in like leather pen cases that I store horizontally, and I find that is fine for pretty much all my pens. So really it's kind of a preference thing, whatever you find works best for you. Scott R. on Facebook said, can you demonstrate how to fill cartridge converter pens from ink sample bottles, such as those used to send in the ink drop samples? So check out Fountain Pen 101 Ink Sampling Part 2. That will show you exactly how to do that. Basically, if you have a pen and it's not quite immersed in the ink enough in that ink sample vial, you tilt it back with the nib pointed up, because most pens fill from the filler hole that's on the back of the feed. So with that feed, you want to kind of immerse that into the ink as much as you can, and tilting the vial will help to get that ink up in there. That will help tremendously. Then another question, Scott. I have a pen that's consistently dry starter, even a few minutes after writing with it, and also that has a propensity for the nib to dry out completely if not used for a couple days. The cap and seal seem fine, so I assume it's not a nib or feed issue. What should I do to diagnose and fix the problem? Okay, some pens are like this. Some pens will just dry out more than others. There's a lot of different factors, the cap, how the thing seals in there and how the threads seal on the cap, that can all be a factor. The feed, the nib design, all of that can come into play. So there's no like one magical answer I can give about what might be causing that. What I will say is it's usually worse in the wintertime. You have a lower relative humidity in the air. You're typically running heaters, which tends to dry out the air, and so pens in general will tend to dry out quicker, especially if you have one that has a propensity to dry out anyway. It's going to dry out even more in the wintertime. So you can store it in a plastic bag. You can try storing it in different positions, like maybe storing it nib down so that the nib will stay wetter. That might help you some, at least on the starting issue. You can try changing inks. Maybe some inks will do better in that pen than others. And then you can also try the tip I mentioned a little bit ago about cutting up a small piece of sponge, wetting it, and putting it inside your cap. You don't want to have a huge piece of sponge because if it's too big and it actually touches the nib when it's in there, then it will draw the ink out of there and draw it into the sponge. So you might want to make a small piece of sponge, but you can always try that one if you find it's a particular thing. But I don't know exactly what pen you're talking about here because you didn't mention it, but that is a couple of tricks that you can try there. So Rebecca S. in an email said, I have a Lamy Safari that has an extra fine nib. It seems to creep really bad with some inks such as Noodler's X Feather. I got a stub nib and it creeps probably worse. I also got a 1.9 millimeter, but what I was wondering is if Lamy Safari is prone to doing this or if there's something off with mine. What are your experiences? I don't think this is anything extremely unusual. Nib creep in general is not uncommon on a lot of different pens, especially Lamy ones. I've used them. The Lamy pens they've got the nib slit, but it doesn't have an air hole or anything like that. So I find that, nibs creep all the time, especially when you have an ink that's heavily saturated with dye like the Noodler's ones. X Feather is an extremely saturated ink. So yeah, you're definitely, having X Feather creeping in a Lamy Safari is not unusual at all. I don't know that the stub has anything particular to do with it. That might just be, a coincidence. But, it is what it is. So what can you do with it? Really it's just kind of a cosmetic thing. Use a different ink will probably help. Different pens will creep differently with different inks and so on. It's kind of it's mainly an aesthetic thing. It has to do with the amount of lubricant that's put into the ink. So the more lubricant that's put in there, the more likely it is to creep. And the reason that there's more lubricant put in is because the dyes that are used in fountain pen inks mainly are drier than with water. So the more dye there is, the drier it's going to write. So they add lubricant in there, but the more lubricant that there is will give it a more likelihood to creep. So that's basically what happens. That's about as scientific as I can get about that because I'm not a chemist and I don't know the MSDS and all that stuff of what is actually put into these inks. There's just not a lot released about it, but I think that's the basic concept. Sara V on Facebook said, another question regarding the polar vortex is that has descended over half the country. My bottle of Diatramentis mint turquoise came in the mail yesterday, but had to chill out literally on the front porch for a few hours before I was able to bring it in. It froze, but the bottle didn't crack or anything like that. I let it thaw and it seems to be just fine now. But is it safe to use in my pen? I get asked this a lot. Okay, you're not the first one to ask me, Sarah, and we answer questions like this all the time. Is my ink going to be safe if I buy it in the wintertime? What if it freezes? What if it has frozen? Can I thaw it out and still use it? And the answer is you're going to be just fine. Okay, if it freezes, let it thaw out and you're good to go. The only time it's really a problem is if it freezes, and then typically just the freezing itself won't break because usually there's some extra room in there or the cap will kind of, flex up and then give way. You might get a little bit of leakage every now and then. We get instances, we ship a lot of ink here. It's all over the place, especially really cold places. The only time that we really hear of there being a problem with breakage is if something freezes and then gets jarred in such a way that it's more brittle when it's frozen. So if it gets jarred and then gets hit, then it might break. But that, in the grand scheme of things, by percentage, is not that many of the inks that we ship out. So there is a potential for that to happen. It's usually not that big of a deal. If it does happen, we'll always make it right, at least here at GouletPens. So, but if you're in a situation like you are here, Sarah, where you have your ink freeze and there's no, permanent damage to the bottle or anything like that, let it thaw out, use it, and you'll be good to go. YJune C on Facebook said, I'm really curious if the Ebonite feed performs better than the plastic one. Although many fountain pens fans tend to prefer Ebonite feeds, it's hard to find a pen that feed, with that feed these days. That's true. Better is subjective. Does it flow better? Not every Ebonite feed is going to flow better than every plastic feed. But generally speaking, if you're talking just by the material itself, Ebonite versus plastic, Ebonite should give a better flow than a plastic feed if you have the exact same design and specifications and everything, because Ebonite itself is slightly more porous. It will help to promote the capillary action, the movement of the ink going through the feed. So purely by that, yes, an Ebonite feed should be better than a plastic one. So why doesn't everybody use an Ebonite feed? Well, it's more expensive and it's harder to make and so on. And plastic is far more easy to produce in a mass scale, so that's why most people do plastic. And plastic feeds, they design them to accommodate plastic, and so generally it's not a problem, which is why you see plastic feeds on just about everything these days. You'll see a lot more Ebonite on vintage pens. The other advantage to Ebonite is that you can actually heat it up and bend it, so you can heat set it. So if you're changing out nibs or if you want to improve the flow and things like that, you can actually heat it up and then mold it kind of to the exact nib that you're using to give it the best flow possible. That's another advantage to Ebonite. And the last thing you can do is you can actually take a knife or something and you can actually cut the Ebonite, and you can increase the flow just by kind of shaving away and widening the ink channel. So that's another advantage. And these are all things that Nathan Tardif is a big fan of. He's a guy who created all the Noodler's pens. All the Noodler's pens have Ebonite feeds. And so he's a big proponent of Ebonite and has videos on it and stuff like that too. Check out his channel, Ink Need Last Forever. He's got some stuff on there in Ebonite. So Jason S. on Facebook. I received a Monteverdi Nighthawk with a 1.1 nib. Any suggestions on keeping it flowing? Writes wonderful for about half a page, then goes dry. Only way to get ink to flow again is to screw the converter a little, forcing the ink to feed. Any suggestions? Yeah, I haven't heard about this happening a lot with the Nighthawk, but it happens with various pens all over the tip. I hear about with Lamis and Monteverdis and all different kinds of models. It's not uncommon to have a pen every now and then that will have some issues like this, where it'll write fine for a while after you fill it or after you flood it, and then it will kind of dry up. So the first thing you always want to do when you're in that position is you want to clean out the pen. Sometimes when you have a new pen, there's manufacturing oils, there's little bits left over from the manufacturing process somewhere in the pen, and it can impede the flow a little bit. And when it's first flooded and you have the whole feed is filled with ink and stuff like that, it's not a problem. But then once it's kind of, you get through half a page or so and that initial filling is kind of evened out, and now you've actually got ink that's kind of flowing through the whole pen, if you've got any leftover junk in there, it may be okay. And if it's something like machining oils or something like that, usually that'll break down eventually and flow through okay. So sometimes if you hear people on forums that are like, oh, I had this pen, it didn't write real well, and then after a while it just kind of fixed itself. That's usually what's happening, is you have machining oils or some kind of cleaning agent or something that was used in the manufacturing process that was impeding and kind of mixing with the ink, and as it worked its way through, it stopped impeding it and then it started flowing just fine. So cleaning it out, especially if you have a pen flush available, that would be fine. If you don't, just use water, a little bit of dish soap, and then use, don't leave the dish soap in there, but then clean it out again with water after you use that. That should help. Usually that'll fix the problem. If that's not it, try a different ink. It could just be that whatever ink you're using may just not mesh well with that pen. Sometimes, seriously, I kid you not, sometimes I have used a pen and an ink, and for no explainable reason, they just don't like each other and they don't want to flow. And then I change it up and it works fine. That ink might work fine in every other pen I use. That pen might work fine with every other ink I use. It's just sometimes they don't like each other, and I don't really know why. That could be the situation you're in. So if you have some other inks, try those out. Or if you have that ink, maybe you can try that in some of your other pens. That you just kind of eliminate that kind of that mismatch variable in there. And then the last thing I would do is contact your retailer. If it's, I'm assuming if it's a Nighthawk, it's me at this point. So, reach out to us. We can try to help you out. And if it comes down to it, we'll swap it out. No big deal. This is where it really helps to get a pen from a company that has a decent return policy, because sometimes with these pens you just run into these little things, and it's not a huge number of them that have these problems, but every now and then you run into these issues, and it's helpful to have somebody that can kind of help you out there. The last thing, if if you're out of your warranty, or you don't remember where you got the pen or something like that, you get it from a friend, and you don't have anybody to talk to really to return it or anything. If you do want to increase the flow, you can do that on your own. It's risky. You're violating warranties by doing this and all that. But if you intentionally kind of press down and flex those tines out on the paper gently, then you can spread those tines and increase the ink flow. You're not going to do it drastically. If you do it way too much, you're going to break the flow and you're going to create problems with the pen, which is why you should kind of do it at your own risk. But that is one way that you can do it. It's not really hard to do, but it's something that can be done. Todd N on Facebook said, just got the Blurple ink drop and just wish I could buy the Nathan Tardif Platinum Preppy Dropper converted pen. So enjoyed buying a bottle of Noodlers with the free pens included. Any idea if they'll be offered for sale? I'd buy a dozen. Well, technically they are for sale. It's a Platinum Preppy. So you can buy a Platinum Preppy and you can have it converted as an eyedropper, convert it yourself. It's pretty easy. The only difference between the ones that Nathan Tardif puts in his Noodlers inks and the ones that you buy, as a Platinum Preppy, is that the Noodlers ones, he gets those pens, he has some kind of arrangement or something, but he gets those pens before that labeling, that Platinum Preppy labeling is put on the pen, so he's got more of a clear body on it. I have heard of people that have used, I think it's denatured alcohol. I can't remember the exact chemical, but some people that have used that to kind of rub away that. Now, you got to be careful whenever you're using something like denatured alcohol. You don't want to use acetone for sure. That will, if you use it extensively on that kind of acrylic like plastic that the Preppy body is made of, it will actually destroy it. It will melt it or cause it to get brittle and crack. So you got to be careful when you're doing that. You can also physically sand away that label. Then you got to polish it up and stuff. It's kind of a chore, but you can do it. I've been meaning to do a video on that for a long time. I just never got around to it. But anyway, so that's the thing. And the only other modification that is done is that Nathan's a funny guy. So what he does, he doesn't like cartridges. If you notice, Noodlers only sells bottles. So when he does his pens, his Platinum Preppies for the Noodlers ink bottles, he actually removes the post that inside that's on the back of the feed that would allow you to put a cartridge into that pen. So if you notice, if you buy a regular Platinum Preppy, and if you look at the back of the feed, it's got a plastic post that allows you to fit a Platinum cartridge on there. That thing does not exist on the ones that you get in the Noodlers ones, because Nathan goes in there and yanks every single one of those out of there. He's a man of conviction. So there you go. So if you want, just buy Platinum Preppies. He uses fine nib Preppies, the black fine nib. That's what he uses in all of his bottles. Okay, and then I've got time for one last question here. I've heard of talk, this is Bryan M from an email I got. I've heard of talk of springing nibs when it comes to flex pens. With a Noodler's flex pen, how does the writer know if he or she is about to push the nib too far? In other words, how do you know when you've achieved maximum flex and had better stop? With the Noodler's pen specifically, they're a little bit different. Typically when you're talking about springing nibs, you're talking about gold nibs, gold nibs that are very soft and very sensitive. And if you take those too far, they will spring out, and springing means you bend it so far that it doesn't bend all the way back, and that screws it up, and you got to get it fixed by a pro to be able to get it back to its normal condition. That's usually what you're talking about with springing nibs. The Noodler's ones, they're stainless steel nibs, so they're a lot harder to spring because they require more pressure, they're stronger, they're not as soft of a metal as a gold nib would be. So it's not something I've really heard being an issue very much. It is possible to overdo it with those, but usually you're going to have to really go crazy to try to do that. The Noodler's ones is pretty natural. You're going to get about 2.5 to 3 millimeters of width out of a Noodler's nib, and that's about all you're going to get. And you'll feel it. You'll feel it once you put a decent amount of pressure on there. You're going to feel pretty much where it maxes out, and if you try and take it any further, you're not going to get any further flex because there's just no more for it to go. There's nowhere else for it to go. So, I don't really have anything scientific to tell you other than just practice, take it a little bit further, and as far as you feel you're comfortable, that's about all you're going to go. But 2 millimeters is you're really safe. 2.5 to 3, you're kind of pushing it. So don't take it out much further than that. But even then, you're really kind of putting your weight on it to get it that far. So you're not going to want to go nuts like that on a regular basis anyway. So I had some other questions prepped, and I just didn't have time to get to them today. I'm really sorry about that, but I'll be back next week on the 17th, January 17th, for the next episode. I'm going back to a topic for next week, and that topic is going to be the trifecta. This is the trifecta of pen, paper, and ink. So this is really kind of bringing it all together here of your whole writing experience. Your pen, your paper, and ink, they all affect each other. They will all impact your writing experience. So I want you to give me any questions about pen, paper, ink, how they might interact with each other, what might be ideal to match up with each other. I really want you to lay it on me. So you can hit me up on Facebook, on Twitter with GouletQA hashtag. You can email me at gouletqa@gouletpens.com. You can leave a comment here on this YouTube video, or you can leave a comment on Ink Nouveau. Lots of different ways to ask me questions. So I'm really looking for some good stuff here. So thanks so much. I really appreciate you coming back to me. It's a really good time. One last thought I wanted to leave you with here is I have been shooting more videos lately. I'm kind of getting in the groove of 2014. And so as I'm looking at my video schedule coming out in the next couple of weeks, it may be looking like I'm going to have my videos stacked pretty well each week. I like to try to stack my videos during the week. I don't usually do too much on the weekends, just because I like to kind of have weekends for my family, and if I post a video on the weekend, you know, I don't want to spend all my time on my computer. I'd rather be with my kids and stuff. So I try not to go on the weekends, but if it comes down to it and I've got 5 videos a week stacked up during the week, rather than doubling up on Friday and doing another video on top of Q&A, I've thought about possibly moving Q&A to Saturday. Because I think a lot of people generally tend to watch Q&A over the weekends anyway, or maybe save it until their commute in the next week. I don't know. So I really want to just kind of get your thoughts about what you think about Q&A. Do you like it being on Friday? Would you be okay with moving it to Saturday or not? Would you rather have it on a different day? In my schedule, it works well having it on Friday, or Saturday would work just as well. I can't really do it earlier in the week because of my other commitments about what's going on in the company here. But Friday works okay. Saturday would work okay for me too. So just a thought I had. Just throwing it out there. I'd love to have your feedback. But anyway, hope you have a wonderful week. I'll see you next week for another Q&A. And as always, write on.